Hello, everyone. I am Marcia Douglas, and I am here with Opal Adisa to celebrate and talk about her recent poetry collection, The Storyteller's Return. Very beautiful book and lovely cover as well. Published last year by Ian Randall Publishers. Opal Adisa is an award-winning and much beloved author of over 20 books and counting. And The Storyteller's Return is a very welcome addition to that collection. In addition to her writing accomplishments, she is a former university director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona, and professor emerita of California College of the Arts. So, there's much that I can say about this book, but I also had the pleasure of reading the pre-pub copy early on, and I wrote a blurb by way of introduction. So I think it might be useful for me to share my blurb. And here's what I said. In Opal Adisa's The Storyteller's Return, home is a complex and many-layered space, a war zone and phantom, but also, and I quote, I love this line, hibiscus promise and duchy steaming with mackerel and rundown, or, and I quote, a linguistic pepper pot. Core to this collection, home is exposed as an unsafe space for young girls. As past and present stories collide, the storyteller is driven to return. For in the end, and I quote, to understand home, you have to use the machete to chop away the filters, end quote. This collection explores not only a physical return to Jamaican space, but also a Sankofa return to community and self, a journey to retrieve and heal. Here, poetry and storytelling intersect with activism and spirituality. Adisa engages all her weapons. The Storyteller's Return is a very welcome and resonant addition to her already impressive body of work. So yes, I'm really interested in, the book's meditations and interrogations of home and how complex return becomes. Along those lines, one of the poems which I love and which I'd like to share is the one she calls Home 3, and it is dedicated to the poet Mervyn Morris. Home 3. Sometimes the only thing to say about returning is there is no need to explain yourself. Everywhere you look has a familiar history. You go back to that day the government chopped down the oldest cotton tree near the ferry police station, and a host of people gathered to witness, to protest, to lament. Your mother said progress often leads to bereavement. You remember her placing the limb of the cotton tree she had taken that faithful day in the garden where she grew vegetables. Every time you drive on Mandela Highway, just below the ferry police station, you see that cotton tree, and you wish everyone could see it too and know you are home. Returning is placing markers to indicate what has been uprooted, what is lost to gain, what we have gained. The trajectory of home gets deleted from the history books. I really love that piece. And Opal, I'm wondering if you can begin maybe talking about the various permutations of home in this book. The book is divided into 4 sections, and it takes us on a journey, you might say, a journey of sorts, and threaded into each of these sections is this notion of home. How does home inform this book? I think that's a good place to start.
I think this book is all about home, what is
Yeah.
real, what is imagined, what
Mhm.
is hoped for. But I'm really glad you read that poem, because that poem is also very important to me, because Jamaica has changed and is changing so rapidly
Mm,
in the name of development, and so
mhm,
many historical markers in terms of the natural environment are being bulldozed for what we call progress, the highway, high rises and things like that. And it seems to me when I was a child, there were certain things that were almost sacrosanct and sacred about home, not just the physical house in which one lived or the yard, as we call the extended outside, but the island. And I think a lot of that sacrosanct placement of things is vanishing. And so,
mhm.
having lived away, as you know, as I did for so many years in California and returning home, I was returning home to what was familiar, as the poem said, but also what was foreign and what was unknown and what was very different, and just trying to decipher and locate myself in that space um, was not a big challenge, but certainly was a challenge. And it still is a challenge. I think when you've lived someplace or grew up someplace, and you leave for as many years as you live there, and the place changes physically, spiritually, in other ways, then there's that transformation. So I was trying to, in this book, that's what I'm doing. I'm saying this is the home I remember in, one section. This is the home that has the history and the culture. This is the home that brings back the memory of some of the things that were good and some of the things that were bad. And this is the home that I'm in, that I have to reconcile, that I have to find my place in, and find the ackee tree or listen to the birds. Because one of the important elements for me through home is about not just the physicality of home, but the environment. So the environment is very much a part, the topography is very much a part of the home that I am talking about in this collection.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. And I'm reminding of this piece, Days of Return. Everyone who leaves thinks about home and plans to return at some point. And I feel as though very much, in this book, there's a way in which you are also speaking to something of the Jamaican diaspora. I love how the collection resonates in that way.
And thank you. It is being mindful of all the people I know and knew in the diaspora, and all the people who are in the diaspora, many
Yeah,
of whom would like to come back home, if not physically, at least emotionally, or at least would like to tell themselves that they're going to come back home, right? And
yeah,
then there are those who want to come back home, but have a notion of what coming home should look like, and having not achieved what that should look like, then they can't come back home. Uh,
yeah,
and then there are those who had an awful time at home because of poverty or other situations. And so, in as much as they would want to come back, they're not coming back because those memories, they haven't resolved or reconciled those bad times that they have. And then there are those who want to come back, but they hear the news and they believe it wholeheartedly. So they don't believe that Jamaica is a safe place, or a place where they could come back and find tranquility and peace. So
yeah,
I am very conscious of the diaspora, having lived in the diaspora for quite a while, and having many friends there, and many Jamaicans, not only in North America, but Europe and other places. And I think for all of us, not just Jamaicans, but I think for all people, home is always a place where you romanticize about. It has a certain nostalgia, even if it is, the nostalgia is not necessarily positive. And there's always, I think, at the back of our heads, at the back of our minds, this sense that I would like to return. If it is
yeah,
but just to have an entrance and to show people that, see me here, I have left, and this is what I've accomplished.
yeah. Thank you for that, Opal. In many ways, I think that you are our poet therapist.
I like that. I haven't thought about that, but I rather like that, because I think once you and I had a conversation, and I think for me in my work, what I'm trying to do, what I'm doing is healing and
Mm,
bridging gaps. And I'm saying we don't all need to return, but if you want to return, you can. But
Yeah.
if you don't, it's okay to hold that space, you know.
Yeah.
And so I really like that. A poet therapist. Yeah, poetry I think is very healing, or can be very healing.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
certainly in my work, it's one of the things that I'm conscious of, because I think so many of us have been traumatized in many more ways than we articulate. And so this is an opportunity for us to do that. And I think so, Marcia, that I think you do that too in the marvelous equation. I think you definitely do that. And I just want to, also big you up, because I think your work is tremendous. I've always thought that, and I've taught your work. And I think what you do in your work is also very important and very meaningful.
Thank you. Story is medicine, right? And we're in that kind of business here. And along those lines, you call this collection story poems. Can you speak a little bit about that term, story poems, and the significance of, why story poems? Why
Okay.
that exists?
I'm always quarreling with these demarcations of genre,
Yeah,
poetry,
yeah.
novels, short stories. And if you look at the body of Caribbean literature and Caribbean writers, many of us are not just poets, are not just novelists, like yourself, you're a poet as well as a novelist.
Mm,
Um, but I realize that I'm a storyteller. It was
mm,
given to me. It was passed on from my great grandaunt, from
yeah,
my my maternal grandfather, and the other storytellers who are part of the Jamaican landscape.
yeah.
And for me, these were not just poems. Not that poems are not just poems, but in each poem, I was deliberately inscribing a story. And so I wanted to signal to the reader that, and also people think that poetry should be difficult and obscure and all of this other notions of poetry that we had. So I also wanted to signal to the reader that, yeah, these have poetic elements, but they're stories that each and every one of us can enter and find some kernel of who we are and what we are. And it was also an attack. Attack might seem like the wrong word, but it was also my conscious and continuous deconstruction of these genres that we are expected to live and abide by, and many of us not taking into consideration how inventive and creative many of us from the Caribbean and the African continent and diaspora has been, in terms of reframing and recalibrating these terms and making them much more useful for us as a people and for writers. So it was both signaling to the reader that, yeah, these are not just poems, they're stories, and also to deconstructing and interrogating the whole issue of genre, poetry, prose, that kind of stuff.
One thing that I'd really like for you to talk about, we've spoken about home and we've spoken about return, but another core element of this collection is the way in which it zooms in on the way in which sometimes home in its various permutations is sometimes an unsafe space for
I'm glad
little
you raised
girls.
that.
Yeah.
I'm glad you raised that, and I'll read a poem which is not about the unsafe space, but this collection is also very much woman focused and girl
Yes.
focused, about many of the abuses that happen to girls and women at home that are sometimes overlooked and not spoken about. And
Mm-hmm.
part of, for me, the first aspect of that was coming to a realization at a very young age that you're a woman, as your mother would, as my mother said to me when I got my period at 10, and how
Mm-hmm.
I was not prepared for that and was not prepared for the way it was framed, because I was a little girl and I didn't know what the hell was happening, even though I should know. So
Yeah.
people tell you about your period and their menses and it's coming, but when it comes, it's a different thing. And this
Mm-hmm.
poem, which is entitled Knowing Three, I think really encapsulate the complexity for a young girl having her period and all of the things that go with that. So here's the poem.
Okay.
When the little girl went to the bathroom and found her panties soaked in blood, she returned to bed and decided to die silently, but only after stuffing the bloodied panty in the dirty clothes basket and putting on a clean one. She was almost 10, and only her paternal grandfather had died, and she remembered him packed with ice in the house with all of them. She hoped they didn't pack her with ice. The storyteller really tried. She scrubbed her tongue with carbolic soap, then hung it on the clothes like line like descending into silence. But the tale swirled as a dancing dervish. She wanted to tell them she understood the shame. They were not discarded shirts used to scrub grimy walls. And in due time she hoped they would rise sturdy and sure as bamboo. Sometimes see and blind, hear and deaf is the only way, the market woman advised her.
Mm.
The little girl woke to her mother singing. She knew it was Saturday as her mother's baking wafted through the room. Propped on her elbow, she looked across to her sister's bed and it was empty. Was she dead too? It's impossible to not chew on cane dripping with sugar left at your door. The sweetness of home attracts bees and deep desire to keep living.
Mm.
Yeah, so that poem, while it speaks to a little girl having her first menses, I think the
Mm.
last two lines, bee also speaks, and the cane speaks to both the sweetness and the other side of cane that we in the Caribbean know so
Yeah.
well. That in order for us to get the sugar, somebody has to labor under very arduous conditions in order for that to yield to sugar. And similarly, um,
Mm.
when a young girl in the Caribbean gets her period, it often begins to mark her assault on the streets, in terms of sexual harassment and other unwelcome
Mm.
comments that
Mm.
plague many young girls in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean, and that they're not given any guidance on how to manage. So, a bee might be bringing, producing the pollen that we need, but it can also sting.
Yes. And there's something of that duplicity which runs through this collection in various ways. Home has its sweetness, of course, but it's also a complex and sometimes a hard place. So there's always this sense of duplicity in everything, all of the themes, experiences that we see running through the collection. Um, Another thing, one thing that I've been always strikes me about you is how prolific you are. You over the years you've had a steady flow of book after book after book, right? And you're very amazing and inspiring in that way. And so I would like to ask you, how do you approach your writing practice, and what is your process like, and how did the poems for this collection in particular emerge?
Okay. Many questions. My process have changed a lot, especially since I've come home, but my process was very different when I was much younger and had three children,
Yeah.
and was teaching full time. Now I have more leisure time because my children are grown, and I just retired. Although when I was writing that book, I was actually the university director, and it was a very demanding job, both in terms of all the things that I had to do administratively, and dealing with gender and gender-based violence and all of those things was very emotionally demanding. But
Mm.
I when I turned 40, I decided that I wanted to leave a body of work. I had already been producing, and I have to say, my oldest daughter Shola was the inspiration because I think my first book, my two books came out just after she was born, and they were the first version of them were written while I was in my doing my master's degree. And when I had her, when I had my first daughter, Shola, I wanted to make sure that I would leave her
Mhm.
something of me, not just the memories and the stories and the things we would do together, but she would have a reference guide that would point to some of the things that I was thinking and feeling and doing, right? And so that has been a steadfast motivation for my work. And having had two other children, I want to make sure I leave them a body of work um, that records the stories and the ideas. So when I decided that I was coming back home, I said I wanted to write a book that spoke to returning, what that meant, right? And I had an idea in my mind. It was primarily, I thought, going to be about nostalgia, what I remembered about home and what coming home felt like. And I said I was going to write in a year, which of course I didn't do. It took 3 years.
Mhm.
But I remember consciously the first week I was home, sitting down and saying, what is it that comes to mind that you're being home now and writing a poem, right?
Mhm.
And my goal at that time was to write at least one poem, 1 to 2 poems every month while I was home. And I started off well, but the demands of work and life didn't quite do that for me. But I was very conscious that this was something I wanted to do. And every opportunity I got, I jot down ideas and notions about home that came to me about that. And so the book, in a sense, was born before I got home, just thinking about coming home. And the original title is I think the title of one of the last poems, Returning to Return, because
Okay.
I was interrogating myself, if can one ever really return? It's the idea of returning, but so Returning to Return was the original title. And then as the poems developed and the manuscript developed, I realized that storytelling was very much still a part of the Jamaican landscape and very much a part of my reality and how I come to explore and know things. And so the Storyteller's Return became the more natural title as it is. So it was a conscious development of,
Mm.
I'm going to write this book about returning, and then having returned, making a commitment to write a poem about returning every week or every month until the collection came together.
They're documents of sorts. They're documents of something of the Jamaican, the Caribbean experience, the Jamaican woman's experience in particular, I would say. And so, they occupy very important spaces in that sort of way, whether wittingly or unwittingly. You have been documenting something for us all along.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think, from my very first big poem, which was The Market Woman, that was always my intention. When I came to writing, and as I come to writing, it's always about, for me, giving back the people the beauty and the strength, and also the not so strength of themselves that I don't think they see. I think we're an amazing people.
yeah.
And I think we have an amazing body of women in all sphere of life. And I am very conscious about documenting and ensuring that aspect of our womanhood is given voice. In my first short story collection, Bake Face Another Guava Story, that was a conscious act. I knew that these women at that time did not have a platform to share their stories, and I saw so much value in their stories. I wanted to make sure that their stories were preserved so that people who come after them would know and understand and appreciate their stories.
Right. Yeah. And I thank you for that. Um, what do you feel that we as writers, what can we do to empower other writers coming along?
I'm teaching an undergraduate class this year for the first time, Intro to Creative Writing, and I have
Mm.
a really wonderful group of students. And I think one of the things they had to do is to do a presentation of four writers, two writers, more than 30 or 40 years, and then contemporary writers. And one of my students is doing a presentation on you. Um, I think one of the things we can do is to simply write, because many of my students were not aware of how many of us there were. And to find and discover us was a plus for them. It encouraged them to write. And most of the class, except for two, there are 20 students and only two are men. And so for most of these young girls, all of whom, except for maybe two, feel insecure about their writing and not sure if they're powerful writers or if their writing will get anywhere, being able to read us, being able to me to point to all of these women writers that exist from Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean is in of itself inspiration and a catalyst. So we definitely need to write. When young writers reach out to us, even though sometimes it's frustrating because you're working on other stuff, it's important that we spend 5 minutes and just respond to them and just encourage them. And just to continue to write the diverse stories and characters that we're writing and developing, so that we understand that there are many stories. The students in the class, some of them are into science fiction, magic realism, some of them are, influenced by dancehall and all of that. And I say there's a place for all your voices.
Yes.
So it's just like how we are sharing our multiple voices, that's the encouragement that I think our young writers and young women need. Because even though there are many of us, Marcia, and I'm not knocking the men because they're great, women in the Caribbean, women writers do not get the attention that our male writers do. We still don't.
Yeah, very true. And you know what's interesting, Opal, what you just said is that your students are saying that they did not know that there were so many of us out there. And what's interesting about what you just said is because that's actually the very same thing that I thought and said many years ago, you know, when I was on my journey to find other Caribbean writers. And you were actually one of the writers that I found, at that time. So that's very interesting to me that something of that same narrative continues, even though I would like to think that things have changed and evolved somewhat over the years, but it is still something of a struggle, and we still very much need to be conscious of that. Before we close, is there another piece that you wanted to read, or I don't know?
Yeah, let's see if we have time in the time that is allotted. Yeah, this is called Days of Return. Home is a poem balanced on the hand of a clock. I was born close to midnight, easy and soft as green Lackaton banana boiled for breakfast. Being the last child of that union, my father had long forgotten his marital promises, slept out at least once weekly, returning home the morning after my arrival. My mother sheltered me from the fever of his rum breath. The hand of the clock moves, but the poem is still unwritten. Returning home, the storyteller decides these memories are zinc roof leaking, warping the wooden floor that has been replaced with tiles. Both mother and father are dead, and she honors them for planting her feet on this land and steering her home. Scanning the landscape, she knows not even death will conclude this poem. Home will always remain unfinished.
Wonderful. Thank you. And you're always a very engaging reader of your work. So thank you, Opal. I think that we are running out of time here, but this is Opal Palmer Adisa's The Storyteller's Return, Ian Randall Publishers, and I invite everyone to read more. Thank you so much, Opal. Thank you for all you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Have a great day.
Thank you.